If you had told me 16 years ago that the same hands which packed my suitcase and pushed me out the front door in the middle of a snowstorm would one day be trembling on my porch railing, begging to be let inside, I would have laughed in your face. But that's exactly what happened 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening, when I opened my door expecting a delivery driver, and instead found my mother and father standing there, thinner than I remembered, older than I ever imagined, holding a single suitcase between them, like two strangers who had nowhere else in the world to go. Before I tell you what happened on that porch, you need to understand what happened 16 years before it, because none of this makes sense unless you know how a 14-year-old girl ends up alone in the world with nothing but a backpack and a bus ticket her aunt bought out of pity. My name is Marin, and I grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone, where the church on 5th Street was the center of the universe, and where my parents, Richard and Colette, were considered pillars of that universe. My father was a deacon, my mother ran the women's ministry. On Sundays, our family sat in the third pew from the front, dressed in matching modesty, smiling the kind of smile that says we have it all figured out. Nobody in that town ever suspected what went on behind our front door, and honestly, for the first 13 years of my life, neither did I, because I thought every family operated on rules, punishments, and silence the way mine did. I thought every father counted the exact number of words his daughter was allowed to speak at the dinner table. I thought every mother inspected her daughter's diary for signs of worldly thinking. I didn't know any different until the year I turned 14, when I made the mistake of falling in love with a boy named Illy who worked at the town's only bookstore, and everything I thought I understood about my family shattered into pieces so small I'm still finding shards of them today. Illy wasn't dangerous. He wasn't even particularly bold. He was 17, quiet, obsessed with astronomy, and the first person outside my family who ever asked me what I thought about something instead of telling me what to think. We talked in the poetry aisle for 45 minutes after school on a Thursday, and that was the whole of our crime. But my father saw us through the bookstore window while driving home from a deacon's meeting, and by the time I walked through my own front door 20 minutes later, my life as I knew it was already over. I just didn't know it yet. He was standing in the entryway with his arms crossed, my mother beside him wearing the expression she always wore when she'd already decided something, and was only waiting for the formality of my arrival to announce it. Pack a bag, my father said, 4 words, no explanation, not yet. I thought maybe we were visiting my grandmother. I was 14. I still believed, in that particular way only children can, that whatever was happening had some kind of reasonable shape to it, that there was an ending where everyone hugged and cried and things went back to normal. There was no normal to go back to. My father told me, as I stood shaking in my bedroom doorway, that I had shown him exactly who I was going to become, and that he refused to let that person leave under his roof and corrupt what he'd built. My mother didn't argue. She didn't cry either, not one tear, which somehow frightened me more than anything my father said. She simply zipped my backpack, closed herself, checking to make sure I hadn't packed anything unnecessary, and walked me to the car in silence. I remember the snow that night with a clarity that still makes my chest tight, fat, slow flakes catching in the porch light, my breath fogging the car window as my father drove without a single word to a bus station 40 minutes away, where my Aunt Dana, my mother's estranged younger sister, a woman I had met exactly twice in my life, was waiting because my mother had called ahead and asked her to take me for a while. A while turned into forever. My father didn't get out of the car. He didn't hug me. He rolled down the window exactly 3 inches and said, "Don't call this house again until you've fixed whatever's wrong with you." And then he drove away, taillights disappearing into the snow, and that was the last time either of my parents spoke to me for 16 years. I want to tell you that Aunt Dana saved my life, because she did, but that first year with her was its own kind of survival. I was a stranger in her small apartment 2 states away, a 14-year-old carrying grief nobody around me could see, enrolled in a new school midsem, Esther, where I told no one the truth, not even the guidance counselor, who clearly suspected something was wrong every time she asked about my parents and watched my face go blank. I wrote letters that first year, dozens of them actually, though I've never told anyone this until now. Letters to my mother explaining that nothing happened with Ellie, that I was sorry, that I
would be whoever they wanted me to be if they would just let me come home. I never mailed a single one.
Somewhere deep down, even then, some part of me already understood that the version of me my parents wanted back didn't exist anymore, had maybe never existed at all, and that no apology I could write would change the fact that they had chosen their idea of righteousness over their own child in under 20 minutes. What I didn't know, standing in that snowstorm at 14, was that this wasn't the end of my story with them. It was only the very beginning of a much longer, much stranger one, because 16 years later, the same 2 people who sent me away without a backward glance would show up on my doorstep.
Nowhere left to turn, and what I chose to do next would surprise even me. I need to back up for a moment before I tell you what happened on that porch, because you can't understand the woman who opened that door unless you understand what those 16 years actually built. People love a redemption story where the abandoned child grows up broken and stays broken, waiting by the window for a parent who never comes.
That was not my story, and I think that fact alone is what made the moment on my porch so unbearable for my father to witness. After Aunt Dana took me in, something hardened in me that year, something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with survival. I stopped writing letters I'd never send. I stopped waiting for a phone call that never came. Instead, I threw myself into the only thing that felt like it belonged entirely to me, school. Not because I loved learning, though eventually I did, but because a guidance counselor named Mrs. Ferris told me, in the gentlest voice I'd heard since leaving home, that an education was the one thing nobody could take from me the way my parents had taken everything else. I believed her, and I built my whole life around that belief. By 17, I had a scholarship to a state university 2 hours from Aunt Dana's apartment. By 22, I had a degree in structural engineering, a field I'd fallen into almost by accident after a physics teacher noticed I was the only student in class who found joy in understanding why buildings didn't fall down. There's a kind of dark poetry in that, looking back, a girl whose entire foundation had been demolished overnight, spending her adult life learning exactly what it takes to keep something standing. By 26, I was working for a firm in Columbus, renting my first apartment that didn't share a wall with anyone else's grief.
By 30, the age I am now, I own a small but respected consulting firm with 4 employees. A modest house with a wraparound porch I chose specifically because it reminded me of nothing from my childhood and a life that, from the outside, looks nothing like the discarded 14-year-old who once stood shivering at a bus station in the snow. I also, somewhere in those 16 years, built a family of my own, not through blood, but through the kind of chosen loyalty that people who've been abandoned learn to recognize instantly in others. Aunt Dana, obviously, who I now call Mom in every way that matters except biology. My husband, Theo, who I met in my 2nd year of college and who has never once, in 8 years together, raised his voice at me, because he understood early on that raised voices in my house used to mean something was about to break, and our daughter, Junie, 5 years old, curly-haired and fearless in a way I never got to be at her age, who calls Aunt Dana Jiggy, and has never met her biological grandparents, and, until 3 weeks ago, never asked to. I tell you all of this not to boast, but because you need to understand exactly what my parents were interrupting,
when they showed up uninvited on a Tuesday evening in early spring.
They weren't walking back into an empty life waiting to be filled.
They were walking back into a life that had been built, brick by brick, entirely without them, by a person they had once looked at and decided wasn't worth keeping. So there I was, that Tuesday, in leggings and one of Theo's old college sweatshirts, hair pulled up messily because Junie had spent the last hour helping me make dinner, which mostly meant flour on the ceiling and a very serious debate about whether dinosaurs ate spaghetti. The doorbell rang around 6:15, and I remember calling out, half laughing, "If that's the delivery guy, tell him the garlic bread better not be soggy this time." As I wiped my hands on a dish towel and pulled the door open without even checking the peephole, something I almost never do, but exhaustion and domestic comfort make you careless in the best kind of way, and there they were. My father, who I remembered as a broad, imposing man who filled doorways with his presence alone, had shrunk somehow, his shoulders curved inward, a gray wool coat hanging off him like it belonged to someone else. My mother stood half a step behind him, her hair completely white now, cut short and practical, nothing like the long-styled waves she used to spend an hour perfecting every Sunday morning before church. Between them sat one suitcase, the kind with a broken wheel that drags sideways, and I remember staring at that suitcase for what felt like a full minute before I could bring myself to look up at either of their faces, because some part of me already understood that whatever this was, it wasn't a casual visit and I wasn't ready. "Marin," my father said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable of my name in a way I had never once heard in 14 years of living under his roof. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Behind me, I heard Junie's small footsteps approaching the hallway, heard her curious voice ask, "Mommy, who is it?" And in that instant, standing frozen in my own doorway with my daughter walking toward two people who had no idea she even existed, I understood that the next 60 seconds were going to determine something enormous, something I couldn't take back once it happened. My mother's eyes, still that same pale gray, blue I inherited, moved past my shoulder and landed on my daughter, and I watched something in her face collapse entirely. Some final wall she'd been holding up for 16 years finally giving way, and she whispered a single word that I never expected to hear directed at me again as long as I lived. "Please" is a small word to carry 16 years of silence. But that's exactly what my mother did in that single breath on my porch. And I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected to feel, and it certainly wasn't what a good, forgiving daughter is supposed to feel in the movies. I didn't feel warmth. I didn't feel relief. I felt Junie's small hand slip into mine from behind, her fingers still faintly sticky with flour, and I felt something protective and fierce rise up in my chest that had nothing to do with the two strangers standing on my welcome mat, and everything to do with the 5-year-old peering curiously around my hip at people she had never seen before in her life. "Mommy, who is it?" she asked again, quieter this time, sensing the tension the way children always do before they understand its source, and I remember crouching down instinctively, putting my body between her and the doorway before I even registered that I was doing it. "They're old friends of Mommy's," I said, which was a lie constructed in half a second out of pure protective instinct, and I watched my mother flinch at the word friends like I'd slapped her, though she had no right whatsoever to feel wounded by it. My father hadn't said a word since my name. He stood there gripping the handle of that broken, wheeled suitcase like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw my father look small. Not humbled, I want to be careful with that word, because humility requires a kind of self-awareness I wasn't yet sure he possessed, but small, physically diminished, a man who had clearly been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally run out of road. We're not here to intrude, my mother said, her voice steadier now, though her eyes were glassy in the porch light. We didn't know where else to go, Marin. We didn't have anyone else. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment the way I had to sit with it standing in my own doorway, because the audacity of it took my breath away, even as some small, exhausted part of me almost felt sorry for her. They didn't have anyone else. 16 years earlier, they had decided that having me was somehow worse than having no one, and now, apparently, circumstances had rearranged themselves enough that no one had become the worse option after all. I asked Theo, who had come up behind me by then, having heard the commotion from the kitchen, to take Junie back inside, and to his eternal credit, he didn't ask a single question in that moment. Just scooped our daughter up with some nonsense about checking if the garlic bread was done, and carried her away from the doorway without letting his face betray the alarm I knew he had to be feeling. Once they were gone, once it was just the three of us standing in the cooling evening air with the porch light flickering slightly the way it always does before I remember to replace the bulb, I finally asked the question that had been building in my chest since the moment I opened the door. Why are you here? Not how are you? Not it's been a long time. Nothing that could be mistaken for warmth or welcome. Just the flattest, most necessary question I could manage. My father finally spoke then, his voice rougher than I remembered, worn down in a way that suggested illness or exhaustion or both. Your mother's sister passed away 8 months ago, he said, which confused me for a moment until I remembered that my mother had an older sister, Patricia, a woman I'd met exactly once at a funeral when I was very young, who apparently had been quietly supporting my parents financially for years without my knowledge. She left everything to a church mission overseas. There was nothing for us, the house. He stopped, swallowed hard, started again. We lost the house in January. We've been staying with people from the congregation, moving around, but nobody can take us in permanently, not at our age, not with your mother's health the way it is. My mother's health. Those 3 words landed differently than anything else he'd said, and despite every instinct telling me to stay guarded, I found myself asking what was wrong with her before I could stop the question from leaving my mouth. Early-stage Parkinson's. My mother answered for herself, holding up one hand where I could now see, in the porch light, a faint but unmistakable tremor she'd clearly been working hard to disguise the entire time she'd been standing there, diagnosed a year ago. I can still work some days, most days actually, but it's getting harder, and your father's knees aren't what they used to be either, and we... She trailed off, looking down at that ridiculous broken suitcase between them, and I understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that this suitcase likely contained the entirety of what remained of their lives. 2 people who had once owned a house with a manicured lawn and driven matching sedans, and sat proudly in the 3rd pew every Sunday, reduced now to a single bag with a broken wheel and 16 years' silence they were finally, desperately, willing to break. I stood there on my own porch, in my own life that I had built entirely without them, staring at the 2 people who had once told me not to come home until I'd fixed whatever was wrong with me, and I realized I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to say next, or whether there was anything in the English language equal to the weight of this particular moment. There's a particular kind of silence that happens when 2 people who once controlled every word spoken in a house suddenly find themselves with nothing left to say, and that was the silence that stretched between the 3 of us on my porch that evening, broken only by the distant sound of Theo's voice inside, keeping Junie occupied with some improvised story about garlic bread dragons. I remember looking at my mother's trembling hand, still raised slightly as if she'd forgotten to lower it, and feeling 2 entirely opposite truths sitting side by side in my chest with no interest in resolving themselves. The first truth was that I was looking at 2 frail, frightened people who had nowhere else to turn, and something in me, something I hadn't fully excavated in 16 years of therapy and self-built stability, still recognized them as my parents and felt the old buried pull to fix things, to take care of them, to be the good daughter I was trained from birth to be. The second truth, standing right beside the first with equal weight, was that these were the same two people who had zipped my backpack shut themselves to make sure I hadn't packed anything unnecessary and driven me to a bus station in a snowstorm without so much as a hug goodbye. I need to think, I finally said, and I watched my father's face fall in a way that almost made me feel guilty, before I reminded myself sharply that guilt was exactly the emotion my parents had spent my entire childhood weaponizing against me, and I would not hand it to them again so easily. You can't just show up after 16 years and expect me to have an answer standing on my porch. My mother nodded quickly, too quickly, the nod of someone terrified that any resistance from her would end this conversation permanently. "Of course," she said. "Of course we understand. We didn't have a phone number for you anymore. We didn't have an address. We found this house through your Aunt Dana's old church directory. Someone mentioned you'd settled near Columbus, and we—" She stopped herself, perhaps hearing how it sounded. The admission that they had tracked me down through second-hand church gossip, rather than any direct effort to reach me in the 16 years prior. I didn't miss it. I don't think she missed saying it either. I told them to wait, and I went back inside, closing the door most of the way behind me, needing a moment of separation between the version of myself standing on that porch and the version of myself who needed to walk into my kitchen and look at my husband and figure out, in the span of about 90 seconds, what kind of person I wanted to be for the rest of my life. Theo took one look at my face and quietly steered Junie toward the living room with the promise of an early cartoon, a rare treat on a school night that she accepted without question, too young yet to sense that something seismic was happening just beyond the front door. "Who are they?" Theo asked once we were alone in the kitchen, though I think some part of him already suspected, because I had told him the broad strokes of my history early in our relationship, the version with edges softened just enough that I could get through the telling without falling apart. "My parents," I said, and watching those two words land on his face was almost harder than saying them out loud to my parents themselves, because Theo had spent 8 years hearing about people who existed to him only as ghosts, as a source of old scars I sometimes still carried without explanation. And now those ghosts were standing solid and real and shivering on our front porch. "What do you want to do?" he asked, and I loved him fiercely in that moment for not telling me what I should feel, for not rushing to either forgiveness or rejection on my behalf, for simply asking the question and waiting, patient while I worked through something that had no simple answer. I thought about Junie in the next room, 5 years old and utterly unaware that the two people standing outside our house had once made a choice that nearly destroyed her mother before she was even born. I thought about the version of me who used to write unsent letters at 14, begging to come home, and how strange it was that the very thing I'd once wanted more than anything in the world, my parents standing at a door asking to be let back into my life, was now happening, except everything about the context had inverted so completely that it barely resembled the fantasy I used to imagine. Late at night, in Aunt Dana's guest bedroom. I thought about my mother's trembling hand and my father's stooped shoulders, and I thought, with a coldness that surprised even me, about how convenient it was that they had found their way back to me only after every other option had run out. I don't know yet. I told Theo honestly, but I'm not leaving them on the porch in the cold while I figure it out. Some decisions I've learned don't require you to resolve every conflicting feeling before you act. They only require you to choose the next smallest right thing, and letting 2 elderly, frightened people out of a chilly spring evening felt like the smallest right thing available to me in that moment, even if it wasn't forgiveness, even if it wasn't a decision about anything beyond the next few hours. I walked back to the front door, opened it fully, and looked at my parents for a long moment.
memorizing the way they looked now versus the way I remembered them, before I finally spoke the words that would change the shape of all our lives for the second time. "You can come in for tonight," I said. "But nothing is settled, not yet, not even close. That first night I put my parents in the guest room down the hall from Junie's, the same guest room where Aunt Dana, the woman who had actually raised me, usually slept whenever she visited from Ohio, and I remember lying awake beside Theo until nearly 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sound of my father's footsteps creaking across my hardwood floors, a sound I hadn't heard in 16 years and never expected to hear again inside walls that belonged to me. Theo didn't push me to talk. He just held my hand under the blanket in the dark and let me exist in that strange, suspended state between fury and something that almost resembled compassion. And somewhere around 1 in the morning, I finally whispered into the darkness, "I don't know why I let them in." And Theo, half asleep, murmured back, "Because you're kinder than they ever were to you, and you're going to have to make peace with that about yourself eventually." Which struck me as one of the truest things anyone had ever said to me, though I wasn't ready to fully accept it yet. The next morning I woke before Junie, before Theo even, and went downstairs to find my mother already sitting at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd apparently made herself, staring out the window at my small backyard with an expression I couldn't quite read. She looked older in the morning light than she had on the porch, the fluorescent kitchen light unforgiving in a way the dim evening hadn't been. And for a moment I simply stood in the doorway, watching her, this stranger who used to be the most powerful figure in my universe, now just a tired woman in a borrowed guest robe, drinking coffee in my kitchen. "I used to make your father's coffee every morning for 31 years, she said without turning around, apparently having heard me enter. Different mug for weekdays and Sundays. He never noticed. I don't know why I kept doing it." It was such a strange, small confession, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I said nothing, just poured my own coffee and sat down across from her, and for a few minutes we existed in a silence that felt less hostile than the one on the porch, though still nowhere near comfortable. "I owe you an explanation," she said eventually, and I felt my whole body go rigid, bracing for whatever justification she'd spent 16 years constructing to explain away what they'd done to a 14-year-old child. "Not an excuse," she added quickly, as though she'd read the tension in my shoulders. "I know there's no excuse. I've had a long time to understand that." She told me then about the church we'd belonged to, the specific brand of authoritarian doctrine my father had been raised in himself, passed down from his own father, a man I'd met only twice and remembered as cold and silent in a way that suddenly made a great deal more sense. She told me that my father had been taught from childhood that any deviation in his children was a direct reflection of his failure as a spiritual head of household, that the elders of our old congregation had specifically counseled families to remove corrupting influences swiftly and without sentiment, and that when he saw me in that bookstore with Ellie, he hadn't been thinking about me at all, not really. He'd been thinking about his own reputation, his own standing, his own father's voice in his head telling him that weakness in discipline was the greatest sin a man could commit. "That's not an explanation, that's a diagnosis," I said, sharper than I intended, and my mother flinched but didn't argue. "You're describing a system. I'm asking why you didn't fight for me inside it." This was the question I had never gotten to ask at 14, the one that had calcified into something hard and permanent somewhere in my chest over 16 years, and I watched my mother's face crumple slightly as she absorbed it, because I was afraid of him too. She said quietly, and it was the first time in my entire life I had heard my mother admit fear of my father out loud, a truth I think I'd always sensed beneath the surface of our household, but had never once heard spoken. "Not afraid he'd hurt me physically, afraid of what he'd say, afraid of being cast out myself if I defended you too loudly. I told myself for years that letting you go was protecting you from something worse, that you'd land somewhere safer than staying would have been, and some nights that almost let me sleep. She looked at me then, really looked at me, in a way she hadn't managed since arriving. But most nights, Marin, I lay awake wondering if you were cold, if you were eating enough, if you hated me, and the answer to that last one, I assumed, was always yes, and I decided I deserved the hatred, so I never reached out to test it. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift uncomfortably inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that the story I'd told myself for 16 years, the clean narrative of two monsters who discarded their daughter without a second thought, was more complicated and more human than I'd allowed myself to imagine, which was somehow both easier and infinitely harder to carry. Before I could respond, I heard my father's footsteps on the stairs, and I watched my mother's posture change instantly, straightening, the openness in her face closing back up like a door, and I understood in that moment, watching the transformation happen in real time, exactly how deeply that fear still lived in her, even now, even here, 16 years and 1,000 miles away from world that had trained her into it, and I found myself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, what exactly still lived unspoken inside my father too. My father came down the stairs slowly, one hand gripping the railing in a way that made me newly aware of how much his body had aged in 16 years, and when he entered the kitchen and saw my mother and me sitting together at the table, something passed across his face that I could only describe as suspicion, quick and reflexive, the look of a man checking whether an alliance had formed against him, and in that single unguarded expression, I understood more about the architecture of my childhood than 16 years of therapy had managed to fully explain. He sat down at the far end of the table, poured his own coffee, and for a while none of us said anything, the three of us suspended in a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. It was Junie who broke it, appearing in the doorway in her pajamas, hair wild from sleep, stopping short at the sight of two unfamiliar adults at her kitchen table. I watched my father's whole body go still as he looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his face I had genuinely never seen before, not once in 14 years of living under his authority, moved across his features, not sternness, not disappointment, something closer to grief. "This is Junie," I said carefully, standing to intercept her before she could cross the room, though some instinct told me not to shield her entirely, not yet, not until I understood what I was actually protecting her from. "Junie, this is—" I paused, genuinely unsure for a moment what words belonged in that sentence, before settling on the plainest version I could manage. "This is my mother and father." Junie, unbothered by the weight adults assigned to such moments, simply said, like Jiggy's mommy and daddy. Which was such an innocent, devastating question that I saw my mother's eyes fill instantly, and even my father, stiff and silent at the end of the table, had to look down at his hands for a moment before he could speak. Something like that. I told her, and she seemed satisfied enough with the answer to ask if there was more cereal, and the ordinary domesticity of that request, in the middle of everything else happening in that kitchen, nearly broke something open in my chest. It was later that afternoon, after Theo had taken Junie to the park to give the rest of us space, that my father finally said what I think he'd come across 3 states to say, though it had taken him a full day and a night under my roof to work up to it. We were sitting on the back porch, my mother inside resting after what she admitted was a difficult morning with her tremor, and my father turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands before speaking. "I've spent 16 years telling myself I did the right thing," he said, not looking at me, looking instead out at my small, ordinary backyard. "That the Bible commanded it, that discipline was love, that you'd thank me one day for holding a hard line. I told myself that story every single night for 16 years, Marin, and I want you to know I mostly believed it." He paused, and I said nothing, letting the silence do the work of pulling the rest out of him. "But watching you yesterday in that doorway,
holding your own daughter back from me like I was something dangerous." His voice broke, actually broke, something I had genuinely never witnessed in my entire childhood. I understood all at once, standing there, that I wasn't a righteous man protecting his household. I was just a frightened man who threw away his child because it was easier than examining what frightened him in the first place. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't, and I have learned enough in the years since Aunt Dana pulled me out of that snowstorm to know that forgiveness offered too quickly is often just another form of self-erasure, one more habit inherited from a childhood, built on making myself smaller to keep the peace. Instead, I told him the truth. I'm not going to pretend the last 16 years didn't happen. I said, I'm not going to pretend I wasn't 14 and alone at a bus station in the snow because you decided I was easier to discard than to understand. That happened. It shaped everything about who I am. The good and the difficult parts both. And no amount of you sitting on this porch admitting it now erases what it cost me to survive it without you. He nodded, and for the first time didn't argue, didn't defend, simply absorbed it the way I imagine a man finally sets down something he's carried so long he's forgotten how heavy it actually was. We didn't resolve everything on that porch, and I won't pretend to you that this story ends with some tidy, tearful reconciliation where 16 years of harm dissolve into a group hug and a happy ending, because that isn't how real healing works, and I refuse to lie to you about that. What I decided in the weeks that followed was this. My parents could stay in a small apartment nearby. One Theo and I helped them secure and partially fund, not because I owed them forgiveness, but because I refused to let cruelty be the last word passed down in my family, refused to let my daughter grow up believing that love is something you earn only through perfection, the way I once believed it. I see them now, occasionally, carefully on my terms, at a pace I control, and Junie is slowly getting to know grandparents who are learning, late and imperfectly, what unconditional love might have looked like the first time around. I didn't get the childhood I deserved, but I got to decide finally, at 30 years old, standing in a doorway that was mine and mine alone, exactly what kind of family I was willing to build going forward, and that decision, more than any single act of forgiveness, is the thing that finally set me free. It's been almost a year now since that Tuesday evening when I opened my door expecting garlic bread and found my entire past standing on the welcome mat instead, and I've thought a lot, in the months since, about why I wanted to tell you this story at all. It would have been easier in a lot of ways to keep this locked inside my own house, to let my parents' return remain a private, complicated thing that only Theo and Aunt Dana and I ever fully understood. But I kept coming back to something my mother said to me on that second morning, sitting at my kitchen table with her trembling hands wrapped around a coffee mug, when she told me she used to lie awake at night wondering if I hated her, and had simply decided the silence was easier than finding out the answer. I think about how many people are living inside that same silence right now, listening to this. People who were discarded by the very family that was supposed to protect them. People who are still waiting, maybe without even admitting it to themselves, for a knock on the door that may never come. I wanted you to hear how this one actually played out, not the fairy tale version, not the tragedy version either, but the messy, real, in-between version, because I think that's the version most of us actually need to hear. Here's what I want you to understand, if you take nothing else from the last 6 parts of this story. Forgiveness and safety are not the same thing, and you are never required to offer one in order to protect the other. I let my parents back into my life, cautiously on my own terms, at a pace entirely dictated by me, and that decision did not require me to pretend the snowstorm never happened, or that 14-year-old me wasn't left at a bus station by 2 people who chose their own comfort over her survival. I want to be very clear about that, because I've had people message me over the past few months, ever since I first started quietly sharing pieces of this story, telling me I was too harsh. On my parents, that family is family. That a good daughter forgives and moves on, and doesn't dwell in old wounds. To those people gently, I say this: you do not owe anyone access to your life simply because they share your blood. Not your parents, not your siblings, not anyone. Access is something you can extend, cautiously, thoughtfully, on your own timeline. But it is never something anyone is entitled to simply by virtue of having once failed to protect you the first time around. I also want to talk for a moment directly to anyone listening who is currently the 14-year-old in this story, the one standing in the doorway with a packed bag, watching a parent's taillights disappear into the snow, wondering what could possibly be so wrong with you that the people who made you would choose to let you go. I need you to hear this clearly. There was nothing wrong with 14-year-old me sitting in the poetry aisle of a small town bookstore talking to a boy about astronomy. The wrongness lived entirely in a system that taught my father his worth was measured by his ability to control the people around him, and that any softness, any deviation, any ordinary teenage curiosity was a threat requiring immediate, brutal correction. If you are living inside a version of that story right now, I promise you, the thing that feels like the end of your world is very likely to become, one day, the very foundation you build the rest of your life on top of. It certainly became mine. Every hard year with Aunt Dana, every scholarship application filled out alone at a kitchen table that wasn't mine, every late night studying structural engineering because some part of me needed to understand how things stay standing after everything falls apart. All of it built the woman who was strong enough, 16 years later, to open that door and decide, calmly, on her own terms, what came next. And to my parents, if either of you ever somehow finds your way to this recording, though I doubt you will, because we still don't talk about the parts of our past that leave outside careful, curated Sunday dinners, I forgive you in the only way I've found that actually works, which isn't a single grand gesture, but 1,000 small daily choices to keep the door open a crack instead of slamming it shut the way you once slammed it on me. I don't forget. I don't pretend the wound never happened. But I also refuse to let that wound be the only inheritance I pass down to my daughter. Junie will grow up knowing her grandparents, imperfect and slow, learning as they are, and she will also grow up knowing, because I will tell her plainly when she's old enough to understand, exactly what those grandparents once did to her mother, and why love without safety was never something worth teaching her to accept. If this story reached you tonight, wherever you are, whatever version of a snowstorm or a doorstep you're currently standing in, I hope you remember this one thing above everything else. The family you're born into does not get the final word on who you become. You do. It took me 16 years, one broken suitcase, and a 5-year-old asking who is it, to finally believe that completely, but I believe it now, standing in a life I built entirely on my own terms, and I hope, with everything in me, that you find your way to believing it a little sooner than I did. Thank you for listening to my story.